Well, thanks to everybody for coming. This is my name is Matt Laux, and this is our third annual Chicago Insight event in the Twin Cities. It's interesting. Just the university itself, I think, has done a great job over the last 10 plus years at really trying to develop programs for students who may not want to go into medical school or law school right after college. And I think some of the work that Sarah has done is great proof of that in terms of now there are programs to help kids get involved with health services or careers in finance or in education. So it's great that that we have Sarah to come tonight and talk about what she's doing at the Urban Education Institute, which is also has only been around for the last, as I understand it, 7 years. So a little bit about the Chicago Society for those of you who have not been to an event before. This is part of a series of events around the world called Chicago Insights, and they're designed to bring supporters of the university together to meet with one another and engage in the, quote, life of the mind. And as someone who's been to a couple of the college fairs around the Twin Cities and met with some students who are interested in applying, that's one thing that as you sit at these booths and you see all these schools, that's one thing that I think the UFC really is able to stand out a lot by that phrase, the life of the mind. And as students come up and ask you, what is it like to go to school there, it's a lot different to talk to them about that. And I think it does help kind of create a brand for the school, which I think is great. So this, to me, events like these are just an evolution of that. Chicago Society members numbered more than 4,700 worldwide last year and made combined gifts totaling over $132 million. And through that financial support, volunteerism, and dedication, the Chicago Society members support the university's commitment to research and scholarship across all schools. And then here in the Twin Cities, we have a committee, myself and Therese Anderson, who, I don't know if she showed up and I didn't see her. Yes, okay, she did, great. Where we will hopefully develop, 1 to 2 events like these every year, where again we could have somebody come in and give a talk and have some good Q&A, and that would be great. So. Now I would like to introduce Sarah Stalinga. I've got a lot to read for her, but I'm going to kind of do a little cliff note version. And the reason is Sarah ran track in college, and as I look through everything that she's done, I don't think anything could have prepared her more for the kind of endurance that she needed to do all this stuff. But suffice to say that Sarah first joined the UEI as an intern in 1995. She worked on development and validation of the STEP assessment and engaged in research on school improvement. She became a research analyst at one part of the UEI, which is called the Consortium on Chicago School Research, or CCSR. She became a research analyst there in 1999. Then she worked for a few years in education evaluation and as an assistant research professor at UIC, not UFC, and then returned in 2007 as a senior research analyst. In 1998, she published her first book, titled Effective Teacher Leadership, Using Research to Inform and Reform. And then her second book on effective teacher leadership, a case study approach, was published this year as well. Sarah received her BA and her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. So without further ado, please join me in bringing Sarah up to the podium.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Matt, for the lovely introduction. And I'd also like to start out by thanking some of the other organizers of this event, Ashley Sinnott, Tim Brennan, and the development office as well, for all that you've put into doing this event. And I actually want to start out by thanking the two most important people in this audience, which are my parents, Joseph and Janice Hallman. Truly, the two of them are the ones who inspired me to be so passionate about education, because they are both educators. My dad, a professor at University of St. Thomas in theology, and my mom, a high school teacher and also a staffing specialist at St. Paul Public Schools for many years. And so I wouldn't be here without you, obviously, and your support. So thank you for supporting me again tonight, as you always do. I imagine everyone here has a teacher that you remember. Perhaps it was a teacher that inspired you to try harder or dig deeper. She pushed you to think about ideas you never would have contemplated otherwise. He guided you through the learning of concepts and constructs that expanded your mind or inspired your imagination or motivated you to work harder than you had ever worked before. Perhaps she's the reason that you chose the career that you've chosen. Or maybe he's the reason why you believe in the possibility and power of urban schooling. She might even be the reason why you're here tonight. For me, that teacher was Mr. Bruce Robb. He was my teacher right here in the Twin Cities at St. Paul Central High School. What made Mr. Robb so special? Mr. Robb held high expectations for all students. We read challenging books for high school: the Federalist Papers, Plato, Aristotle. He pushed and prodded discussion from different angles until all students understood the complexity of those very complex texts. We sat in a circle and talked about ideas as a pathway to learning. I remember vividly a discussion of Plato's Cave, being astonished and inspired and transformed as we talked about the shadows on the wall. Mr. Robb was an expert facilitator, listening, making connections, drawing out student ideas, yet pushing us and prodding us, challenging us, molding us to be better, to be more excellent. Those discussions of challenging great books pushed me to desire deeply to read and to crave intellectual discussion about ideas. The desire to discuss great ideas and to be challenged led me, as many of you know, to the University of Chicago, where I spent 4 years as an undergraduate sitting in circles and talking about great books and great ideas. In addition, Mr. Robb's classroom methods defined my own teaching methods now to undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Chicago. In short, the hours I spent in Mr. Robb's classroom defined my career path and transformed my life. I am who I am today because of Mr. Robb. And I'm pleased to say that Mr. Robb is with us tonight here in the front row. And I feel so fortunate to be able to say these words to you and to tell you how you influenced and molded me. Could you stand up and be appreciated? So the question that we grapple with tonight is, how can we put great teachers in every classroom? Imagine American public schools with an exemplary teacher for all students, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're black or white, whether they're immigrants or natives to America. The transformational power of teachers is unmistakable. Making that pathway of an exemplary teacher into every classroom is dependent upon 3 domains of work. It depends upon reconceptualizing teacher training, thinking about evidence in new ways, and creating models of excellent schooling in which teachers are developed, supported, retained, and sustained in the profession. I'm going to talk briefly about each of these ideas tonight and the intersections of these ideas with the work of the Urban Education Institute at the University of Chicago. And then I hope to engage in some conversation with you about urban education and the ideas presented here. So I want to start with the challenges because, as you know, as consumers or as participants in urban education yourself, the challenges are great in urban education. I want to start with this headline from the Chicago Tribune from 2006. This comes from research that we conducted at the Consortium on Chicago School Research, the applied research wing of the Urban Education Institute. It was front page news. What is the message here? The message is that if you are a 13-year-old in Chicago public schools, you have a 6.5% chance of graduating from a four-year college by the time you're 25. If you're an African-American boy, you have a 2.5% chance. In short, approximately 1 in 50 African-American young men who are 13 at the beginning of high school will complete four-year college within 6 years of graduating. 1 in 50. These findings are a call to action, and yet when they were released, there was no outrage, there was no public outcry, no social movement, no rally, no demand to dismantle public education and reconceptualize it. Now, this is why we care. This is just one of the many outcomes that are associated with educational attainment in the United States. Here, if you look at the difference between the income of somebody that doesn't graduate from high school versus somebody who has a professional degree, the difference is about $70,000 per year on average. Across a lifetime, this is more than $1 million in terms of income. I show you this one outcome, but there are many other outcomes associated with educational attainment as well. Almost everything that you appreciate in your life is associated with your educational attainment, including your health, whether you vote or not, whether you volunteer, your children's educational attainment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Importantly, everyone does not have a fair chance at receiving an education in our current urban public school system. This graph depicts the achievement gap in third grade reading in Illinois. The top line is white students in the state of Illinois. The bottom line is African American children in Chicago public schools. Across the nation, we see this gap between white and black, rich and poor. This, again, is the call to action for the work that we're doing at the Urban Education Institute, in particular, this discrepancy between haves and have-nots in our country. Here's the final piece of the challenge that I'm going to lay on the table tonight, and this is about teacher evaluation in particular. What you see on the screen is a distribution of teacher evaluation ratings in 2007 in Chicago public schools. 93% of teachers in the system were rated excellent or superior. 7% were satisfactory, and that tiny little sliver that you can't really see is 0.3% of teachers who received an unsatisfactory rating. This is despite the fact that principals, teachers' union leaders, and teachers themselves agree that this is not an accurate representation of teacher quality in Chicago. So the question becomes, given these calls to action, given this pressing need to reform urban schools, what do we do, and what is the role of urban teachers in that? I'm going to start with talking about effective teacher training as one of the foundations for improving schools and positioning teachers to be effective. It is well known that the quality of our teachers influences the successes and failures in public schools, and that in schools that serve a large proportion of minority and low-income students, this is a particularly pressing need. And yet, our system of teacher training and evaluation are clearly broken. 50% of urban teachers leave the profession within 5 years. They leave the profession within 5 years. And in high-needs areas, a turnover rate of about 80% of teachers is not unheard of. At the same time, we're in a context where schools of education are generally not held accountable or responsible for the quality of their graduates. Nobody counts where they teach, how many of their teachers stay in teaching, whether or not they're in high-needs contexts, and how their students are performing. And it's also the case that aspiring teachers are generally not counseled out before they enter the profession, which can be problematic in the same way that it would be problematic for someone to enter an engineering career when they didn't have the appropriate skills to do that. This is what our current pipeline looks like right now. Degree, to license, to practicing teacher, to tenured teacher. There's no ongoing support built into teacher training. There's generally not meaningful evaluation of teacher practice where teachers receive feedback that they can then use to develop themselves and to improve themselves professionally. And recall the graph that I just showed you with that distribution of ratings of most teachers falling at the top of this teacher evaluation system. Clearly, there are good and some very extraordinary teachers. However, it's clear that teacher training and induction and supports are not working in U.S. public schools. So what can we do differently? First of all, we need a full year of clinical support for teachers, the way that we train aspiring doctors, for instance. These should be highly selective programs that only select the most highly qualified, top-notch students into the mix. They need to provide financial support for teachers and incentives for expert teachers to engage in student teaching and clinical preparation of teachers. An effective teacher preparation shouldn't end when teachers enter classrooms. It should involve ongoing mentoring support wherever teachers land, and where mentors come into classrooms to evaluate teacher practice, have critical conversations about instruction, and make improvement of teaching an ongoing goal. Programs like UEI's Urban Teacher Education Program do exactly that. Our teachers spend a full year in clinical training as student teachers. This translates into 4 placements, where our students do student teaching for a summer, each of 2 semesters, and then a summer again before they're actually placed in a school. And then we provide our graduates with those 3 years of ongoing support in their classroom. We think about our training model as a 5-year teacher training program that truly will prepare our students to be sustained in urban context and to be successful. And so far, the results are promising. So far, more than 95% of our graduates are still teaching, and they're still in urban schools. Compare that to the 50% turnover rate that we just discussed, and the 80% that's common in the high-need schools where our graduates are working, and we feel like we have something to build on here. The second foundation of improving schools and situating urban teachers into the work that we're doing depends on evidence. Building this system that supports great teachers relies upon thinking differently about evidence. The best classrooms, the most effective schools, the best businesses, the best governments all rely on using evidence in a robust way. Yet in education, somehow, evidence has come to mean standardized tests and only standardized tests. We need new kinds of evidence at multiple levels to improve public schools. So what kind of evidence do we need? I'm going to talk about evidence at multiple levels. So moving beyond standardized tests to think about using evidence to improve districts, to improve schools, and to improve classroom and student outcomes. So starting at the district level, what I have on the screen here is an illustration of an indicator that the Consortium on Chicago School Research has constructed that we call the on-track indicator. And essentially what this predictive indicator allows us to do is using a combination of things like attendance and grades and course failures. This indicator predicts with 80% certainty by the end of the freshman year which kids will graduate from high school. We actually can apply this indicator and predict for 80% of the students correctly whether they'll graduate just by looking at these pieces of information from their freshman year. And as you can see on the graph, what this has done is to drive progress in Chicago public schools. They've adopted this indicator as part of their accountability system, and they also use this to track progress at the district level. And what this has done is the percentage of on-track students peaked when the consortium first published its report on the on-track indicator, and then once the consortium published a set of reports that really instructed the district on how to use these indicators, we see that the on-track rate has reached an all-time high. Now, what we hope to do is look at the relationship between these on-track students and actually demonstrate that it's leading to more kids graduating from high school, which would mean that it's a powerful use of evidence at the district level. This is the kind of evidence we need to drive school improvement. We also need school-level evidence to drive school improvement. Researchers from the consortium in 2010 released a book called Organizing Schools for Improvement. It's based on 20 years of research in Chicago. And in essence, we found that schools serving children from Chicago's most disadvantaged neighborhoods made substantial progress if they attended to 5 critical things. The things themselves will not surprise you. They're ambitious instruction, student-centered learning climate, the professional capacity of the teachers and the staff, parent and community engagement and ties, and leadership, instructional leadership in particular of the principal. Specifically, we found that schools that are strong on 3 or more of what we call these essential supports are 10 times more likely to improve than schools that are weak on them, and they're 30 times less likely to stagnate. Essentially, what the consortium has done here is to identify aspects of urban schooling that adults must attend to simultaneously to give students a better chance at achieving in life. And these tools that the consortium has created to measure these constructs provide powerful indicators that can be used all over the country to guide the school improvement process. And it also dismantles and challenges this idea that there's a quick fix, a silver bullet to urban education reform, when the truth of the matter is attending to one of these things in terms of a school reform agenda will do nothing to improve urban public schools. Let's think for a minute about another level of evidence that is important for improving schools, and this one's particularly important for teachers. Teachers need fine-grained diagnostic assessment that tracks student progress over time, both their social and their academic progress. This is the way that teachers adjust their instruction to improve outcomes for students. It's the way that they differentiate among students to give students what they need. What I have on the screen in front of you is a summary of one such diagnostic assessment that was developed at the Urban Education Institute called the STEP Literacy Assessment. Essentially, what it does is it provides diagnostic evidence about exactly where a child is in the developmental process of learning to read. And it then provides interventions that apply to each step level that a student is assigned to improve students' literacy over time. This graph then summarizes at the school level the kindergarten results on the STEP assessment. And it helps us to understand then the students that are below, at, or above the target that they need to be reading to learn by the time they're in 3rd grade, which is a critical indication of whether students will be successful. These types of evidence provide much more information than a standardized test score about how we actually drive school improvement and the outcomes of children. Finally, the last foundational piece that I want to talk about tonight is creating exemplary schools. Teacher training and evidence use. How could we possibly talk about education without talking about schools? It's a critical piece of this 3rd domain. Having excellent teachers relies upon creating excellent, exemplary places for them to work, for them to train, for them to develop, for them to be evaluated, and for them to be rewarded for their performance. What do models of excellent urban schooling have in common? First of all, these schools have a shared understanding of effective teaching. It's a shared language about instruction and what strong instruction looks like. Importantly, teachers' classroom doors are open and practice is deprivatized, meaning that peers are looking at one another's classrooms, that there's rigorous evaluation and critical feedback for teachers, which is the antithesis to what generally happens in education today. There's also meaningful teacher evaluation using appropriate tools and deep critical conversations about instruction. We also see instructional leaders, principals as instructional leaders, principals who have the time and space to be separated from their budget and from management to actually be in classrooms assessing teachers and helping them to develop. They also have rigorous early childhood programs, particularly for children who come to school from other than middle-class backgrounds. I have colleagues here tonight from the McKnight Foundation President Kate Wolford and Bonnie Hauk, the program officer, who are working hard in the Twin Cities to build these important pipelines from pre-kindergarten to 3rd grade, right here in the Twin Cities. This is exactly what needs to happen in these models of exemplary schooling, to think about how we knit together from pre-K through 12, thinking about this pipeline. These exemplary schools then, they're organized around the types of evidence that I just demonstrated, that I just showed to you, around diagnostic assessments, around thinking about assessments of the school organization and school organizational improvement. And they involve parents. They're highly engaged. And they also provide more time for students who need it. Before school, after school, extended day, extended year. The United States has one of the shortest school years in the world. And not just developed nations, but also in developing nations as well. We cannot prepare American children for success without more time. Our charter schools are using these approaches. One of the things that the Urban Education Institute does, in addition to training teachers in the Urban Teacher Education Program and doing applied research in the Consortium on Chicago School Research, is that we actually run 4 charter school campuses on the south side of Chicago. 2 elementary schools, pre-K through 5, a middle school, which is 6 through 8, and a combination middle school, high school, which is 6 through 12. Using these approaches, we found some early successes. Recently, we tracked every student who leaves our school after 8th grade to determine how many actually finish high school, wherever they enroll in the city. This is what we found over the last decade. You see that compared to the national average of 67 or 68%, compared to around the 50% rate that we see in Chicago public schools as a whole, that our high school graduation rates of our graduates, wherever they end up in the city, was 88% for what will be the class of 2011 for college, and 95% for what will be the college graduating class of 2012. So we're starting to see some really good indications that our model is working. Our valedictorian, in fact, from University of Chicago Woodlawn, our high school campus, is right here in the state of Minnesota at Carleton College, and our graduates are all over the United States. Here's another indication of our early success. I showed this slide earlier with just the top and the bottom line in it, demonstrating the achievement gap between white students in Illinois and the bottom line being CPS African American students. What you see in the 2 lines in between are our elementary charter schools, where one line represents North Kenwood Oakland campus and the other represents the Donahue campus. Our goal is to close the achievement gap. It would have been, in some ways, easy to be satisfied with the kind of progress that we had in 2007 to say, you know what, we're outperforming students like ours, African American students in Chicago public schools, by about 10 percentage points. But our goal isn't to be as good or a little bit better than Chicago public schools. It's to close the achievement gap between high and low needs students in the state, and we feel like we're getting some good results towards that. So in closing, how do we go about doing this kind of work at scale in the United States? And in short, putting a Mr. Rob in every classroom requires some hard work. It requires reconceptualizing teacher training to include intensive clinical practice, ongoing supports for teachers, and meaningful evaluation. It requires reconceptualizing evidence use in new ways to improve instructional practice in the classroom, to push organizational development at the school level, and to push on districts to improve their initiatives as well. And it's dependent upon creating models of excellent schooling. This, to us, is the existence proof. We talk about it as the existence proof. We need to prove that this can be done with low-income students who come from sometimes difficult circumstances. And we believe that poor and minority children can achieve at the same level as their middle-class counterparts, and that's what we're trying to prove at UEI. So to close, I leave you with a little statement about a belief in what is possible. It's great to talk about teacher training and evidence in schools, but the foundation of the work that we're doing is believing that students can do this work no matter what their backgrounds are. And so to do that, who better to talk about this than somebody who knows a little something about believing in what is possible. This was our first convocation speaker at the first 8th grade graduation at the North Kenwood Oakland Charter School with an important message about belief.
I am deeply honored to be allowed to share in this wonderful celebration of North Kenwood Charter School's first 8th 8th grade graduation. me particularly proud because I was present at the inception of the charter school. I remember when all the hard work was being put in to just get the school started, trying to find the space, trying to create a vision for what educational excellence might be in our communities. Before I say anything to the graduating students, I think it is appropriate for us to congratulate once again the faculty and staff and founders of this organization. So I want all of you to think about the prospect of setting the bar as high as possible. There's no reason why all of you can't get straight A's. There's no reason why you can't go to the best colleges and universities in the land. There's no reason why you can't obtain the best jobs. There's no reason why you shouldn't just work in a corporation, you should own a corporation. There's no reason why you shouldn't just work in government, you should be at the top of government.
So I guess he was talking about himself just a little bit there, right? So with that, I open to your questions and comments, critical, friendly, and otherwise, about the work that we're doing at the Institute and about some of the ideas that I've talked about tonight. Yes? I will repeat the questions. The first question, which I'll attend to, is about whether the Urban Teacher Education Program is both for undergraduate and graduate students. The original program, the UTEP program, for the first 5 years of the elementary program was for undergraduate students at the University of Chicago only. So they started in the program in their 4th year in the college, using elective credits to take the UTEP requirements, and then they moved into a master's degree program in the 2nd year. The 6th cohort was the first cohort that the application process was open to graduate students from other institutions. And now it's the case that the majority of the students that are trained in the Urban Teacher Education Program are not from the University of Chicago. And that was the first question that you asked. The second is about selection of students. It's funny because I had several conversations about this movie, Waiting for Superman, which I'm sure many of you have seen. And that lottery scene, or those lottery scenes in the movie, are very familiar, maybe not quite as dramatic as Hollywood would like to make it seem. But we do have a lottery system in place for our charter schools. And so students enter through a random lottery in all of the campuses. It's interesting because it actually leads to a little bit of a challenge. The state law leads to a little bit of a challenge for us. The original charter law does not allow us to set attendance boundaries around our charter schools. This was put into place for a very good reason. It was so somebody couldn't open a charter school in a very affluent neighborhood and then block student access from other places in the city. But what it does to us, because our motivation is to serve low-income students, the better and better and better our schools get, the more people want to come and bring their kids from middle-class areas. And our mission is to serve low-income kids. So we're actually working on establishing, 3 of our schools now have attendance boundaries around them to preserve these as low-income schools. And the vast majority of our kids on our campuses, depending on which campus, between 80 and 90% of our students are low-income, high-need, free and reduced lunch kids. One of the interesting things, too, I'll say about the lottery aspect of this is that because it is a lottery and because it's random, we have the opportunity for research purposes to compare the students who get into our charter schools to the students who enter the lottery and do not. And we're getting some pretty phenomenal indications of the kind of value add that our charter schools provide to the students that actually get admitted through the lottery, which in some ways reinforces the Waiting for Superman message. Little lower drama, but it's a similar message. Yes?
2 questions as well. What are you doing to scale this across the country? And second of all, what are those experiences as you've attempted to scale it?
Okay, good questions. These are really critical to our work. First, what are we doing to scale and what have been the successes? I would say that our focus on scale is a new focus. So really our first intention was to create great place-based success. So proving that we can produce really high-quality teachers for Chicago, getting the applied research on Chicago Public Schools right, and actually running schools for kids on the south side of Chicago. So now that all of these different organizations have been around long enough to be seeing results, now we're outward facing, we're thinking about scale. The way we think about scale is influencing at scale. So it isn't that we imagine that our charter schools will be replicated as they are in their current form in other places. Knowing what we know about school reform, and the fact that even if we took our charter school model and we moved it to a Latino neighborhood in Chicago, it's unlikely that it would translate precisely. What we try to do is influence through components of practice that can scale other places. So for instance, let's take the STEP assessment, which is the diagnostic tool literacy assessment that I talked about earlier in the presentation. That tool is actually being used in states across the country in a lot of different types of districts. Baltimore just adopted it, for instance. And the on-track indicator, which the consortium developed for Chicago, is now being used in states and cities all over the country. So we think about influencing a scale as those kind of practices and tools going into other contexts and being used successfully. I saw another, yes.
And since everyone's asked questions in pairs, I'll do the same. Because I
You're testing my memory here.
Well, I appreciate
okay.
couplets, but one relates to an experience very close to home here. In the last several days, we've been hearing about perhaps the need to close North High School.
Yes.
A once very vibrant place. Both of my kids went to school on the south side. Mm-hmm. North was a powerhouse at that time.
Yes.
I mean, in sports, academics, it was a magnet school. I guess my question is, I really appreciate the success you've had, but if you create a new school, mm-hmm. and even if you don't select the students, it's just a lottery. No parent, I mean, the kids who are in that lottery are going to be kids who have someone behind them saying, this is good, you ought to go here. You're not going to get the kids who don't have that kind of support. So I'm just wondering, when you talk about the scaling of this, how do you get it? I mean, because one of the arguments or one of the complaints about what's happened in North High is this happened because we opened enrollment to everyone. And the kids who could went somewhere else. But now we have a community on the north side of our city that's lost one of its focal points. Mm-hmm. And then the second question is, where does the money come from for this?
Okay.
Because I don't think the lesson of this election was Obama's all wet and everything else. I think the lesson might be we might be way too selfish a country for our own good. And we might not be willing to go into debt to pay for health care and education the way we were to pay for 2 wars. I mean, the same question came up then, and Cheney said deficits don't matter, and nobody complained. There was no Tea Party. There was nothing like that. So that's a more loaded question than I meant to ask, but it was, how do you get this out of the charter school format to schools that folks aren't going to fight to get into?
Right.
And where does the money come from?
Okay, those are both really good questions. The first question, I think, is a legitimate question, and one of the things that we do as an organization is we actively go out and recruit parents and students in the neighborhood who wouldn't otherwise apply, which I know does not completely eliminate your concern. But it's also the case that we're doing a lot with parent engagement, too. One of the interesting structures that we have in place in our charter schools are public schools. That's important to keep in mind. We receive public money. It's, for all intents and purposes, a public school. And so we are allotted positions the same way that a traditional public school would be. And we're allotted in our schools a principal and an assistant principal position. We have chosen, rather than to have an assistant principal on our campus, to have a director of community and parent engagement. So that person, their full-time job is to engage parents. It may be the case that some of these parents are motivated, but this model is really intensive. For when we have kids who come in so far behind, and we have to accelerate their learning to get them to college by the time they're done with 12th grade, it means that our school buildings are open from 7 to 7. It means kids are coming to Saturday school. And in order to do that, parents have to be engaged in a meaningful way to commit to getting their kids there, to commit to using these diagnostic assessment results to drive the performance of their kids. And so that parent engagement piece doesn't disintegrate even if these happen to be motivated parents. And I guess on the funding question, the funding question is a really critical one for scale, because if it's the case that this is just outlandishly expensive, and it's so expensive that it's out of reach of public school systems elsewhere, then it goes against our mission, because our mission really is about doing this at scale in America, providing an existence proof that can be used other places. And so what I can tell you about this is, because charter schools are public, we receive the per pupil expenditures from the school district as the foundation for our schools. Now, it is the case that Illinois is 48th in terms of per pupil expenditures. And what we're doing is we're providing about another $1,500 per pupil per year, which puts us about, controlling for standard of living differences, about at the level of New York or Boston, or a more progressive level of funding in terms of public education. So this is not outrageously expensive, what we're doing. It's just aligning resources differently. It's being more coherent in our approach. And it's also using the resources that we have in smarter ways, including the time resource. Time is a funny resource, because a lot of times it's probably overlooked. It's really easy to overlook as probably the critical resource in a school. More critical than the money is, what are you doing with the time that you have? And if you're giving students the same thing that they were getting before for 12 hours a day, you're going to get the same results. So I would say that the time resource is the critical one in the work that we're doing. Yes?
Thank you. Interested in curriculum, particularly the early education results that show you closing the achievement gap. Do you have the same curriculum as other Chicago public schools? And I have a special question. Is there extra courses, enrichment courses? Is there music? Are there things like that?
Absolutely. And a lot of that falls into our extended day program, but also in the regular programming of the school: language, music, arts, all of that. But in terms of your first question about the curriculum, at the lower grades, it's a balanced literacy approach. And it's all rooted around this step assessment that I described, which has this very clear pathway to developing early literacy skills. And this balanced literacy approach is what undergirds it. So guided reading, guided writing, writer's workshop. And so it's moving away from the traditional basal approach to teaching students and having them engaging in reading and writing in a really authentic way. That's the nature of the instruction at that level. Yes?
The students who come in at 6th grade under grade level, and you accelerate their level of learning to be college ready
Right.
at 12th grade. Can you talk about what that curriculum, specifically the reading, looks like?
So a lot of this, again, is additional time focused on those students. So these students have a wide range of experiences, discussion folks. I mean, I would say if you looked at our middle to high school itself, there is really a lot more variation in the type of instruction that you would see at that level than you would see at the elementary level, which is probably common to what you would see if you looked at a high school versus an elementary school almost anywhere. So there certainly are teachers in our high school that are very didactic, they're very lecture-oriented. But I would say, and then there's also more authentic sort of intellectual work going on there as well. But I think what differentiates the 6 to 12 model is it's accelerated and it's extended. And so we're moving beyond the constraints of the school hours and moving into broader time periods to do this more accelerated approach to learning. It's literature-based, it's discussion-focused, a lot of it. And to be honest with you, there's an additional layer that goes above and beyond what students are reading and the types of work they're doing around just college readiness in particular. So we have a college readiness strand in our middle and high schools that focuses on things like, what does it take to get to college? What kind of dispositions do you need? What GPA do you need? What even is a GPA? What kind of forms do you need to fill out? How many schools should you apply to? So a couple of weeks ago, I ran into the school director of University of Chicago Woodlawn, our 6th to 12th grade school. And I said, Shane, what's going on? What's new at the high school? And he said, today I have 425 students from our school in 16 states on numerous college campuses looking at colleges. That whole way of reconceptualizing and thinking about preparing students to think about this as their pathway and their trajectory to college, I think is another additional layer above and beyond whatever we're doing in the classroom around English and math, et cetera, et cetera. It's belief that you can do this, but also the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to actually get kids to college and then keep them there once they're there.
One question. You said that a lot of the students that are coming now are students from outside of the University of Chicago. Are most of these teachers still fresh out of training, or have they been working for a while? And are you having to kind of retool or re-educate, or how is that? What's the demographic of the people coming?
So the question was about the teachers who are in our charter schools, how many of them are new, the experiences that they have, and also how much we're retooling and training. I think that we understand teaching as a profession to be a developmental process, regardless of where teachers are trained and regardless of whether they're new or veteran. And so when you come to a University of Chicago charter school as a staff member, you understand that you're buying into long-term professional development in an ongoing way, which means because our school day is 8 to 4:30 and maybe 2 to 3 days a week sometimes, our teachers are in professional development together, which is a luxury that is not afforded a typical public school teacher. But what it means is that we have these very rigorous evaluation structures where the understanding is our classroom doors are open, we're here to help each other improve as peers, the school director is in my classroom observing intensively what I'm doing. And so I would say, yes, absolutely, there's retooling, but it's a school cultural expectation that we're all on a developmental path and that we're responsible for our own growth and the development of our peers. And one of the autonomies afforded a charter school is being able to remove teachers in a way that is much easier than you can in a traditional union-governed system. And so that, too, provides additional accountability for the teachers in a way that's different. As you saw, the distribution of ratings in the public school system, it's very different from that way of thinking about achievement. Yeah.
I guess I get a third question. Have you looked at taking this? Looked at taking this to traditional public schools? And I guess it's a fourth question. And if so, how soon do you see doing that?
So by this you mean the Chicago model
The Chicago
itself.
model, yes.
There's a history, a precursor history, I guess, to what we did at the University of Chicago in urban education prior to what we're doing now. One of the precursor organizations was called the Center for School Improvement. And actually, when I first started as an intern, that was the organization where I was an intern directly out of college. And the model of improving schools was working with networks of traditional public schools to improve practice, with this very well-specified model around training the principal as instructional leader, around this rigorous literacy approach, around using diagnostic assessments, many of the things that we're using in our charter schools. We did that work for about 10 years, and part of that work was really the motivation for creating the charter schools, which was we found that the system constraints around doing that kind of work in a traditional public school was difficult because of the constraints the public schools face, because principals turn over regularly, because there is a teacher evaluation system that doesn't really promote teacher improvement, and frankly, because it's the case that many of the teachers in those schools did not believe that the students that were in their building could achieve at these levels. They just didn't have the belief that this was possible. They would have been, if their school got to that 60% mark of their kids at Meets&Exceeds, that would have been victory. That would have been, now we can rest. And so the charter school, us creating the charter schools was about saying, look, here's the existence proof. We're doing this with the kids in the neighborhoods that you said where it could not be done. And so now that we have that particular piece in place, I would say what we're trying to do is send our University of Chicago UTEP graduates into these traditional public school settings, armed with this belief in the kids, armed with this knowledge of these diagnostic assessments, and to push improvement in the traditional public school system that way, among others. Certainly the consortium plays a role in that, in using evidence to push the school system and schools on their practice, and then also sending our graduates into the traditional public school system. One of the questions I got asked when we were just talking informally was how many of our charter schools, how many of our graduates of the Urban Teacher Education Program staff our charter schools? And actually, it's just a handful. And so our mission for the Urban Teacher Education Program is to push and scale improvement in traditional public schools, and that's the way we think about that work. Class size is a hard one. If you look at the research on class size, you have researchers who essentially use the same data to say class size doesn't matter and class size really matters. And so there really is, and that's really the common school reform research problem, is that even using the same data and having very good, rigorous research, it's not very clear what the answer is. But what we do know is that once you get below a certain threshold, particularly for low-income minority kids, class size does make a difference. It kind of gets washed out in the aggregate. If you look at all kids, lowering class size does not have as much of an effect on more well-to-do students. But for the kids that we serve, class size has been demonstrated to make a difference. And it's also not just the class size, but it's the adult to student ratio. So there are two different ways to think about reducing that. You can put 2 adults in the classroom, or you can reduce the class size. And we've done both of those models in our schools. One of our schools uses, at certain key grade levels or grade levels that are struggling, 2 adults in a classroom of 25 students. In other charter schools in our network, it's more reducing class size and having smaller classes to begin with. But if you looked at our charter schools, you would see variation by grade level, and you would see variation in terms of the intensity of the adult supports in a classroom. And part of that goes back to the diagnostic evidence. So what we need to do is really understand which teachers are struggling, which students are struggling, and what concepts or constructs do they not know, do they still need to learn. And then using those diagnostic assessments to focus supports in the appropriate places to make progress. And so in that way, it's a much more nuanced way of thinking about class size, because we're focusing that as one resource of many to actually drive progress at the school and the classroom level. Yes?
I myself went to a public school, a large public school in the Twin Cities, and we live in a suburban area here, and the large school systems here have, the typical sort of tracking system where kids are put in different areas. There's special ed, there's the accelerated programs, the individual schools compete with different accelerated programs, and now there's a lot of competition with the open enrollment. There's Chinese immersion and all kinds of stuff everywhere. My husband and I, we visited a high-performance charter school here in sort of a more underprivileged area, and it really surprised me that they did not have a tracking model at all. Mm-hmm. Instead, they said, okay, we're going to have everyone have these high expectations. We're going to try to have everyone go to college. We visited a classroom that was like 2nd grade. There was a 5th grader there, and he was, clearly a difficult student. He might have had problems that were significant. I mean, it's very impressive graduation rates. You guys must face students that have a variety of problems, from, dyslexia to maybe some type of autism. And with normal schools, a lot of the cost is the special ed, the special type of programs. How do you deal with kids that come in that no amount of, are going to need like a lot of additional resources just to deal with their problems?
Well, I had to smile at Mr. Robb, because we knew all about tracking at St. Paul Central High School, and in fact, we're the focus of a very unfortunate news story that really highlighted the discrepancy between the kind of education that I received in the Quest program on the 5th floor and the kind of education that was going on in the traditional track in the school. And so what I will say there are a couple things I'll say about tracking. Number one, it's clear why tracking exists. It's because if you look in if you put all of the kids in a 3rd grade classroom in a typical public school into the same room, you probably would have a range of abilities in reading, for instance, that goes from students who don't read at all up to the 8th grade level. So how does a teacher, who has in a typical urban classroom 30 or 30 plus kids, attend to all of the individual needs of those students? And so it's the reality. And as you mentioned, our charter schools face that reality every day with these really wide ranges. By the time we get to our middle school, we have kids that have gone through the pipeline in our elementary school who are at grade level or close to being on grade level. And then with the system turnover, we have students come into our school who may not be reading at all or barely reading by the time they enter middle school. And so I think these models of education that you're talking about focus on training teachers to differentiate in classrooms. And differentiating meaning you're not tracking them into separate rooms, but you're finding instructional formats in which you can work at students on the level where they are and accelerate them to where they need to go, but you're not permanently placing them in contexts where those tracks will always be parallel. One of the things we know from the tracking research is that students who sit on the line between tracks, so students who could either go to the traditional track based on their achievement or could go to the accelerated track, that disproportionately white students end up in the accelerated track and minority kids end up in the regular track. And these are kids who really probably are very equal in terms of the abilities or the outcomes that they come into the classroom with. So the main goal is to combat that it doesn't become this way of continuing to perpetuate social inequality between classes and races of people out of habit, but rather learning to teach teachers how to do this very difficult and nuanced way of differentiating their practice for different groups of students. So for instance, what that might look like in a classroom is there's a group of students who are working in learning centers independently at the first grade or second grade level with an adult guiding them, while the teacher's working intensively in guided reading with students who need additional supports. So they're finding those kind of ways of actually keeping students in heterogeneous groups, but also attending to the fact that they have differences in terms of their background and needs is the goal of the type of education that you're talking about. But very hard, to be frank, to do well. Yes?
Sarah, thanks so much for your complete answers to all of these questions. You've been doing a great job. My question is about the preschool and birth to K programs. Can you just let us know a little bit about how you guys address those issues?
Well, one of the things that we are really committed to is pre-K education for all of our kids. So the fact that they're pre-K through 5 elementary schools, which if you're familiar with the context of pre-kindergarten, is a very unusual configuration. And again, I refer to my colleagues at McKnight that are struggling to promote this kind of coherence and a pathway to that in the Twin Cities because it's very hard work to do. One of my colleagues at the Urban Education Institute describes pre-K and K through 3 as separate galaxies, separate funding, separate curriculum, separate training programs for the teachers. And so the fact that we're doing that in a real and coherent way is very important. Now for us, because we don't have the capacity to undertake all of these initiatives ourselves, one of the ways that we're doing that currently is with a partnership with an organization called Ounce of Prevention that does birth to early childhood initiatives. And so in our work, a lot of times we have to rely on external partners to help us think about doing this work in a real way. But that's our goal, is to make that a coherent pipeline from birth through elementary school and into high school. Right.
Presumably they don't have to be confronted in the context of the expansion of that.
Absolutely. I did mention, and many of you probably know, that charter schools, teachers in charter schools are not part of the teachers union, which is both a critical part of the autonomy that our schools have, but it's also the case that it's not my intention to demonize unions, because I think that's, if any of you have seen the Waiting for Superman movie, I think it's one of the real shortcomings of that movie is that it makes leaders like Michelle Rhee, district leaders, superheroes, and it makes teachers unions the villains. And I think that's a really inappropriate way of portraying what's actually the complexities around what's happening with teachers unions. And so certainly we have interaction with the teachers unions through our own teachers, most of which are teacher graduates from the Urban Teacher Education Program, most of which who are in traditional public schools. And certainly we deal with the teacher evaluation aspect of that. One of the research projects that I'm leading at the consortium focuses specifically on teacher evaluation and trying to revitalize teacher evaluation in Chicago public schools. And so I think we're dealing with those issues in a very real way, but it's also the case that I would be misleading you if I wasn't honest about the fact that it is one of the autonomies that helps us to do some of the things that we do in our charter schools that are difficult to establish in a traditional public school. Extended day, teachers' contracts that extend outside of the regular collective bargaining agreement, et cetera. So it's a tricky issue. I do think there are ways to do this work in traditional public schools with union agreements, and certainly teachers' unions have been much more receptive to the idea of revitalizing teacher evaluation than ever before, because they know the system is broken as well as the rest of us do. So I think we're in an opportune moment in terms of working with teachers' unions, and particularly with the drive from the federal government around revitalizing teacher evaluation practices in this country. This is a good moment for us to open the conversations around some of these really tough teacher union issues.
What about the green-eyed monster problem for success and sometimes happen in education?
Say more about that. Right. I was hoping you have to give the illustration to the audience. 5th floor Central High School. Tell us that story.
Well, we were in a traditional high school, and we thought that we should have a program that could serve young people, all young people, but especially young people like you, that could benefit from the great classics, that because they're timeless and human and humanities-oriented, would serve the community well and serve young people and families well. And I was usually a piranha in that setting much of the time. I didn't go to the lounge because very often, and I was with the students instead in the classrooms because some of those students in Quest also felt like piranhas in the building at times. There was that green-eyed monster of Iago, that jealousy.
That's right.
That's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And it's a real...
You have a successful program, and so I know that there are some people out there that...
It is the next challenge that we face in our organization, which is now that we have demonstrated success for our schools, we face 2 challenges. One is related to that, the way that our schools are perceived, the teachers within them are perceived. Certainly, people cast this as, oh, they're charter schools. That aspect of it we have to attend to. And then it's definitely the case that we're going to have to deal with just the high volume of desire of people to enter our program and not being able to get admitted to it, and the way that casts our schools and the university, et cetera. So I don't have an answer to that question. I should have known you would ask the question. I can't answer.
Well, the reason why I ask it is that, the hard part in going to the lounge, and I had a lot of good friends there, but there were also some lounge lizards, I call them. And, the problem was that if I was around folks like that very often and for too long a time, it was very depressing.
Yeah.
And it drags one down.
That's right.
I much preferred being with the bright eyes like yourself.
Right. And so, I mean, you're speaking to one of the problems that our urban teacher education program graduates have. We instill them with all this enthusiasm and these sort of idealistic pictures of what schools are like and what principals are like and what instruction should look like. And then they land in these schools and they're like, what am I doing here? My colleagues don't think the way I do. I'm a little bit elitist and a little too confident because I came from the University of Chicago. And that is a real challenge, is helping them to be successful in the context where they're placed, both being appropriately respectful of the fact that their colleagues of 20 years, even though their instruction doesn't look like mine, have something to offer, being respectful of parents, regardless of the fact that there's a difference in income and education level, that these parents have something to offer me. And so I think we are dealing with that challenge on a lot of different levels. And sometimes they find these schools to be very lonely places by virtue of the work that they're doing and the aspirations that they have. One thing I will say, one of our new ideas is trying to place our UTEP graduates in schools together. So we actually have multiple graduates in a place, so we know that we have ready-made colleagues for them, and that then they can attend to being teacher leaders from their classrooms and trying to push school improvement as teachers, which is the model of teacher leadership that we push them towards.
Thanks.
So Bonnie, are you going to get the final question?
Okay. Uh-oh, I better make it good. Yeah. Well, I have a loud voice. It seems like in education, sometimes we and also our communities and business leaders look at what's a deficit. And I think the University of Chicago offers us some models to look at that show us what we can do. For example, the baseline data in the 5 areas. Mm-hmm. So we can, granted, Minneapolis is not like Chicago, and St. Paul is not exactly like Chicago, but you've identified 5 areas of assessment that we can use as baseline data and study, well, what are the things that you're doing that work here and what don't, and why don't they work, and what are the lessons learned? And so I think maybe in a summary statement of everything that you shared with us tonight, to go into those big pieces of things that are replicable, even if you're not a charter school, because I believe, which is why Sarah is our evaluation expert and also on the advisory committee at McKnight for our initiative, because they've identified ways of looking at education that are research supported and diagnostic and can be really helpful in framing the good work that we need to do. So maybe you could summarize those things for us.
Bonnie, you are fantastic. It's always good when you get a question about something you should have talked about in detail and you didn't. And of course, Bonnie and I got to spend the morning together, so we're well aligned. But I think these 5 essential supports that Bonnie is talking about, this parent community engagement, instructional guidance, the capacity of the teachers, instructional leadership of the principal, these cornerstones of school improvement, and the fact that we have tools to measure them and empirical evidence to support the idea that if schools are attending to these, they're much more likely to improve. One of our ways of thinking about scale is to take that tool, that survey tool, and make it available for every school in the country. So schools can actually use that survey to measure their progress on each one of these different indicators. So how do we look this year in the teacher-teacher trust measure compared to how we looked 2 years ago? How do we look in terms of how do teachers see the instructional leadership of the principal, and how does that look over time? And we know if those essential supports are improving, that it's very likely that the other outcomes that we care about for students will follow that. And so that's an important part of our scale strategy, is taking tools like that and making them available for every school in the country. So thank you for the perfect seed for pushing some of what we're doing.
Thanks very much, Sarah. The endurance, obviously, she's been great. So please join me in thanking Sarah for